Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1: Arrival at Whitford House. The train from London slowed as it approached Whitford Halt, a modest country platform half hidden by summer greenery. Hercule Poirot, seated neatly by the window, glanced at his watch and gave a small nod of satisfaction. The train was 3 minutes early. This pleased him. He rose carefully, brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his immaculate dark suit, and adjusted the crease of his trousers with the air of a man who would not tolerate disorder in any form, not on fabric, and certainly not in facts. Whitford House had been recommended to him as a delightful place for a little holiday. It belonged to Lady Agnes Whitford, a distant acquaintance whom Poirot had once encountered at a London luncheon. She had written effusively, insisting that a stay in the country would do him a world of good, and that her household would be honoured by his presence. And so, he murmured to himself as he stepped down onto the platform, Hercule Poirot takes a holiday. We shall see what kind of holiday, n'est-ce pas? A liveried chauffeur awaited him, standing beside a dark motor car. He bowed slightly. Mr. Poirot, sir? From Whitford House. Poirot inclined his head. You are punctual. I approve. Order, it is the foundation of civilization. The chauffeur, who was not certain how to respond to this, merely opened the door. The car moved off along a narrow lane lined with hedges and fields, the air filled with the faint scent of hay and wildflowers. Cows grazed lazily in the distance, villagers on bicycles raised hands in greeting. It was an ordinary English summer's day, peaceful and calm, just the sort of day, Poirot thought, that liked to hide the possibility of tragedy. Whitford House was impressive without being grand. A wide, pale stone facade, ivy clinging in disciplined patterns, tall windows reflecting the blue of the sky. An avenue of lime trees led up to the front steps, where 2 stone lions sat guard, their faces worn smooth by time and rain. The front door opened before the car had fully stopped. A butler, tall and severe, appeared, followed by Lady Whitford herself, fluttering in pale silk like a dignified moth. My dear Monsieur Poirot, she cried, sweeping down the steps. How delightful, how truly delightful, that you have come. Poirot stepped from the car, bowed, and raised her gloved hand briefly. Madam, the delight, it is mine. You have a charming house. We do our best, she said, with a pleased little laugh. Come inside at once. You must be exhausted from the journey. We are just about to have tea on the lawn. I insist that you join us. Within a few minutes, Poirot had been shown to a guest bedroom, tastefully furnished in soft creams and greens, where his suitcase was placed with proper care. He straightened his tie in the mirror, admired his own moustaches with professional pride, and then followed the butler down to the garden. The tea table had been laid beneath a great chestnut tree. China cups, silver spoons, neat sandwiches, and small iced cakes formed an inviting display. A faint breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Everyone, Lady Whitford announced, this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. There was a murmur of greeting. Poirot took in the group with one sweeping glance, his eyes sharp though his expression remained pleasantly mild. There was Oliver Whitford, tall, slim, with a good-natured face that at the moment looked tense. Opposite him sat his cousin, Henry Whitford, shorter and thicker in build, with a blunt jaw and restless eyes. Poirot sensed, in the stiffness of their shoulders and the way they avoided each other's gaze, a strain that had nothing to do with the heat. Poirot, who had been apparently absorbed in stirring his tea, watched them keenly from beneath his eyelids. The quarrel, he noted, had the air of something long-standing, merely attaching itself to a convenient object, in this case, the pocket watch. What is special about this watch, if I may ask, he said gently. Oliver answered first. It belonged to our grandfather, Colonel Whitford. He carried it in the war, and it still has a dent from a bullet. Henry added, with an air of challenge, he entrusted it to me before he died. I was the one at his bedside. Not Oliver. That is not what he said to me. Oliver exclaimed. He told me that as the younger, I should have something to remember him by, since you had the house and everything else. Perhaps you misheard, Henry said coldly. You often misremember things when they don't suit you. Silence fell. Somewhere at the far end of the lawn, a gardener's shears clicked rhythmically. A bird shrieked briefly and flew off. Lady Whitford fluttered. Do stop it, both of you. Anyone would think we are savages. You are grown men, not schoolboys fighting over a marble. Miss Clark spoke quietly. Perhaps it is not about the watch at all, she said, her eyes on her plate. Henry shot her a sharp look, then glanced away. Poirot thought, there are layers. He leaned back in his chair. It is strange, is it not, he said softly, how the small objects of life come to carry the great weight of the emotions. A watch, a ring, a photograph, they are like little mirrors, reflecting much more than themselves. Arthur Lane chuckled. You're thinking like a philosopher, Monsieur Poirot. In my experience, people quarrel over anything they can get their hands on, small or big makes little difference. On the contrary, Monsieur, Poirot replied, it is often the small. The slight. The insult that seems so unimportant to the one who gives it, and yet so deep to the one who receives it. That is where the trouble begins. Beside Lady Whitford sat Miss Greta Clark, her companion a woman in her late 30s, with smooth fair hair and a composed, watchful face. Near her lounged Arthur Lane, a family friend, easy and cheerful, who seemed more interested in the teapot than the company. Please sit here, Monsieur Poirot, said Lady Whitford, indicating a chair with a fine view of the table and the house. I insist you take the best seat. You must judge for yourself if our scandalously ordinary tea is worthy of your refined tastes. Madam, I am certain it will be perfect, Poirot replied, seating himself. For some minutes, the conversation remained light. They spoke of London, of the weather, of trivial matters that people use to fill silence. Yet Poirot noticed that each remark between Oliver and Henry carried a faint edge, like a blade wrapped in velvet. The butler came and went, replenishing teapots, offering more cakes. Poirot accepted one but did not eat it immediately. He rarely ate without observing those eating with him. At last, the conversation turned, as it often does in families, to objects of memory. And of course, Lady Whitford was saying, your grandfather would be quite astonished to see how much fuss is made about that old pocket watch of his. Henry laughed shortly. Not as much fuss as some people make, Aunt Agnes. Oliver here seems to think it belongs to him by divine right. Oliver's face flushed. We agreed, Henry, that I should have it, years ago. You suggested it, Henry retorted. I never agreed. Grandfather showed it to all of us. It is a family heirloom, not a toy to be passed about. A toy? Oliver's voice sharpened. You barely noticed it until I mentioned taking it to be cleaned. You've kept it stuffed in a drawer. Henry put his cup down rather too firmly. That is my affair. You've always wanted what you can't have, Oliver. Always. Lady Whitford gave a delicate cough. Now, boys, please. Not in front of our guest. Henry rose abruptly. If you'll excuse me, I have letters to write, he said. I'll leave the philosophy for another time. He walked towards the house, his back rigid. Oliver watched him go, jaw tight. He muttered, half to himself, letters, indeed. Poirot turned his head slightly. You do not believe he has letters to write, Monsieur Oliver? Oliver started, as if caught out. Well, it is only that Henry likes to make an exit, that is all. He always has some important business no one else understands. Lady Whitford sighed. Those boys will be the death of me. And all for nothing. Absolutely nothing. Do not distress yourself, madam, Poirot said. Families, they have their little storms. He looked across the lawn to where the house stood, serene in the sunshine. Yet he felt, in the silence left behind by Henry's departure, a curious chill, like the first faint breath of wind before thunder. For there was something in the cousin's eyes, in the tightness of his mouth, that had not been explained by a mere disagreement over a watch. And sometimes, Poirot reflected inwardly, the little storm grows. He lifted his cup, tasting the tea at last. It was, as he had predicted, perfectly made. But the atmosphere, he thought, was not perfect at all. Chapter 2: A sudden disturbance in the night. The first night of Poirot's visit to Whitford House passed in outward tranquillity. After dinner, the guests dispersed early, some to the drawing-room for reading, others to the terrace for cigars. Poirot excused himself sooner than most, claiming that the country air had made him drowsy. In truth, he wished to think. The quarrel at tea, though minor in topic, had revealed strong undercurrents. Poirot knew from long experience that such currents rarely settled without stirring something unpleasant from the depths. He sat in an armchair in his guest room, slippers neatly placed beside his feet, and reflected upon Oliver and Henry Whitford. Their hostility had not been born yesterday. That much was evident from the precision of their insults. Only long acquaintance allows for such accuracy in striking the opponent's weak points. Always the eldest, always the heir, Poirot murmured to himself. And the younger, the overlooked. The dynamic was familiar. He slept soundly, as men of ordered habits often do, until sometime after midnight when a faint sound broke the stillness of the house. Poirot's eyes opened at once. Years of alarm clocks had trained his mind to wake sharply, without confusion. The sound came again, not loud, but abrupt. A door shutting? A muffled footstep? Poirot sat up, listening. Then silence returned so complete that it made the disturbance seem almost imaginary. Still, Poirot did not believe in imagination when facts might exist. He rose, donned his robe, and opened his door. The corridor was dim, lit only by a lamp at the far end. Shadows stretched silently along the carpet. Poirot could not say from which direction the noise had come. He considered investigating further but decided that wandering unfamiliar corridors in the dark might create alarm in the household. An alarm, he had learned, often destroys valuable evidence. He returned to bed, though his mind continued to turn. Breakfast the next morning was taken indoors due to a light drizzle that mothered the landscape in mist. The household gathered slowly, chairs scraping, cups clinking, polite greetings exchanged. But one chair remained conspicuously vacant. Lady Whitford looked at the empty space with increasing agitation. Where is Henry? It is nearly 9:30. He is never late to breakfast. Even as a boy he rose before the servants. Oliver said nothing, merely spreading marmalade on toast with more force than necessary. Arthur Lane laughed awkwardly. Perhaps he has decided to have a lie-in. Though I confess I have never seen Henry indulge in such decadence. Lady Whitford signalled to the butler. Please have someone fetch him. The butler bowed and left the room. A hush settled over the table, broken only by the rain tapping lightly on the window panes. After several minutes, footsteps returned. The butler reappeared, his usually impassive face showing the faintest tremor. Your ladyship, he said quietly, Mr. Henry is not in his room. Lady Whitford blinked. Not in his room? Nonsense. He must be somewhere in the house. Did you check the study? Indeed, madam. Mr. Henry is nowhere to be found. Miss Clark set down her cup sharply. Has anyone looked outside? Perhaps he went for a walk. Poirot observed the faces around the table. Oliver's was pale, though whether from concern or something else, Poirot could not yet determine. Lady Whitford rose. We must search the grounds. Henry must be somewhere. The household scattered like startled birds, servants included. Poirot joined the search, though at a slower pace than the others, for speed rarely leads to clarity. The lawns, gardens, and stable paths were examined first. Nothing. Then Arthur Lane, breathless and muddy, came running from the far side of the house. He's found, he shouted. Henry's in the library. At once everyone hurried inside. Poirot followed last, knowing that rushing into a scene often destroys the story it might tell. The library was a long room of dark wood and tall windows. Books lined the walls, a hearth sat cold in its grate. Near the mahogany desk lay Henry Whitford, his body crumpled on the floor. A teacup rested on a small side table, untouched but not empty. The faint smell in the air struck Poirot's nose at once, almond. Bitter almond. Lady Whitford let out a high, thin cry. Miss Clark covered her mouth. A servant crossed himself. Poirot knelt slowly, not touching, simply observing. The skin of the dead man's face was unusually pale, almost waxy. His eyes were half open, as though surprised by the sudden interruption of life. The cup had a ring of tea around its inside, and the teaspoon beside it bore the faintest trace of sugar dust. Poirot sighed softly. It required very little detective skill to recognize cyanide. The constable from the nearest village was summoned. The local doctor confirmed what Poirot had already deduced. I'm afraid he's been dead several hours, the doctor pronounced. Poison. Cyanide, most likely. Oliver's voice broke out suddenly, too loud in the shocked silence. Poison? That cannot be. Who would do such a thing? Poirot looked at him gently. The list is longer than you think, monsieur. Oliver stared at him. Are you implying? I imply nothing, Poirot said. I observe that the quarrel of yesterday was more passionate than the subject would suggest. And when the passions are stirred, very foolish actions become possible. Lady Whitford sobbed. Oh, my poor Henry. My poor boys. What have they done to one another? A quarrel over a watch? Over nothing at all. Poirot tilted his head. On the contrary, madam, it is never over nothing. It is always over something. Only the nature of the something varies. The constable attempted to take statements, though his notebook trembled with his hand. It was clear he had never dealt with a death so fine and delicate in motive. Oliver sat apart, head bowed, running his fingers through his hair as though trying to comb out the memory of every sharp word exchanged with Henry in his life. Poirot approached him quietly. You are distressed, monsieur, he said. Oliver looked up, eyes red. Of course I am distressed. We argued, yes, but I never wished him harm. Poirot folded his hands. There are two kinds of harm, you understand. The harm we do with our actions, and the harm we do with our words. The first kills the body. The second often kills something much harder to revive. Oliver said nothing. Poirot glanced once more at the cup, at the spoon, at the biscuit crumbs on the plate. There is something here that does not quite align, he thought. Something small. Something out of place. And Poirot, as always, trusted the small. For in the small things, truth hides most comfortably. Chapter 3. Questions in the tea room. The shock of Henry Whitford's death hung over Whitford House like a pall of smoke. The constable, overwhelmed by the gravity of the matter, sent a telegram to the county authorities, and a proper investigation was promised by evening. Until then, the house remained under a peculiar silence, not quite mourning, not quite fear, but a mixture of both. Poirot seated himself in the small tea-room adjoining the conservatory, sipping a cup of hot chocolate, for he disapproved of English tea at moments requiring clarity of mind. His gaze drifted toward the rain-specked windows, though his thoughts were nowhere near the weather. It had not been a crime of impulse. That much, he knew. To procure cyanide required forethought, to introduce it into Henry's tea required opportunity. And to ensure no one noticed, that required boldness. He placed his cup down with precision. The quarrel. The watch. The insult. Motives can be built from trifles as easily as from fortunes. The quiet was broken by the sound of footsteps. Lady Whitford appeared, her eye swollen but her posture held with stubborn grace. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, settling into a chair opposite him, "I am told you assisted the police in many distressing matters." Poirot inclined his head. "That is so, madam." She twisted her handkerchief. "Then I beg you, tell me, do you believe Henry took his own life?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He had learned that silence often revealed more than words. At last he said, gently, "No. Monsieur Henry did not take his own life." Lady Whitford closed her eyes briefly. "They will say it was Oliver." "I know they will. They argued, oh, they are always arguing, and now Henry is dead. But Oliver is not capable of such wickedness." Poirot steepled his fingers. "You speak with the heart of a mother, and the heart, it sees only what it wishes to see." She swallowed. "And you? What do you see, Monsieur Poirot?" "I see that the quarrel was not new, nor trivial. And yet, I also see that murder requires more than passion, it requires calculation. In such cases, we must not ask who argued loudest, but who planned quietest." Lady Whitford shivered. Before she could reply, Miss Greta Clark entered, carrying a tray of untouched sandwiches. She paused when she saw the two in conversation. "Oh, forgive me," she said softly. "I did not realize." "Do come in, Miss Clark," Poirot said. "I wished very much to speak with you." Miss Clark hesitated, then placed the tray down and sat near Lady Whitford, her expression reserved. Poirot began without flourish, "Mademoiselle, yesterday at tea, you said something very interesting. You suggested the quarrel between the cousins was not about the watch." Miss Clark's eyes flicked to Lady Whitford, then back to Poirot. "I only observed that the watch made a convenient excuse. The tension between them has been growing for months." Lady Whitford exhaled heavily. "Greta sees far too much for comfort." Poirot smiled faintly. "It is a useful skill." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Miss Clark, this tension, from where did it come?" Miss Clark clasped her hands in her lap. "Henry has always pushed Oliver beyond reason. He liked to remind him of his position, as heir, as the one who mattered. Oliver resented it, though he tried not to show it." Poirot nodded. "And the matter of inheritance?" Lady Whitford stiffened. "Surely you are not suggesting?" Miss Clark answered before she could. "It has always been understood that Henry would inherit the house and estates. Oliver is expected to make his own way. It was their grandfather's wish. But Henry wielded that fact like a weapon." Poirot tapped his fingertips on the table. "The advantages of birth often create disadvantages of affection." Lady Whitford rose abruptly. "I cannot endure this discussion any longer. If you excuse me." She hurried out, leaving Poirot alone with Miss Clark. He lowered his voice. "Mademoiselle, one thing puzzles me. When Henry left the tea table yesterday, you watched him go with an expression, how shall I say, not merely of concern, but of disappointment. Miss Clark blinked. Did I? You are very observant, monsieur. Poirot bowed his head modestly. It is my business to observe. But what I observe, I do not always understand on the first look. Miss Clark folded her arms defensively. Henry and I were friends, Monsieur Poirot. Close friends. Closer than family, sometimes. There was emotion there, tightly guarded, but real. Poirot asked softly, and did Oliver know of this closeness? She hesitated. That hesitation said more than any answer. Poirot filed the detail away like a card in a mental index. Later that afternoon, the rain died off, and the sun returned, turning the wet lawns into mirrors of green. Poirot walked the grounds with measured steps. He did not need to search for footprints, he needed to search for context. Near the south side of the house, he encountered Arthur Lane smoking a cigarette under a lime tree. "Ah! Monsieur Poirot," Arthur called. "Come for a bit of fresh air?" "I know I needed it, dreadful business inside." "Dreadful?" Poirot nodded. "It is a very English habit, is it not, monsieur, to escape one's discomfort by going outside?" Arthur laughed, flicking ash. "Yes, well, better to flee to the trees than to watch everyone point fingers indoors." Poirot joined him. "Tell me, monsieur, as a friend to the family, how did you see the quarrel between the cousins?" Arthur shrugged. "Like most family spats, ridiculous but inevitable. They're both proud, you see. Henry enjoyed winning, Oliver enjoyed not losing. And neither could ever quite resist provoking the other." Poirot listened. "But," Arthur continued, "Henry could be unkind. Oliver would needle him, yes, but Henry struck harder. He liked to humiliate." Poirot nodded slowly. "It takes only one spark to ignite a fire when the kindling has been drying for years." Arthur sighed. "Poor Lady Whitford. She tried to keep the peace, but there's only so much a mother can mend." Poirot turned his gaze toward the house. "Monsieur, do you know if Henry was engaged in any business lately? Something besides family quarrels?" Arthur raised a brow. "Business? Not that I know. But there was some trouble with his solicitor last month, something about updating his will. Caused quite a stir." Poirot's eye sharpened. "Updating it in what way?" Arthur shrugged. "No idea. He wouldn't tell anyone. You know Henry, secrets made him feel important." Poirot exhaled. "Ah. The human vanity. It is always an ingredient in tragedy." As evening approached, the county inspector arrived with 2 constables and a great air of seriousness. He questioned the household, inspected the library, and paced with heavy steps. Poirot observed him with mild amusement. He would, of course, reach the obvious conclusion that quarrels lead to murder and the cousin who argued must be guilty. But Poirot, as always, paid attention to what others ignored. The unlicked teaspoon. The faint sugar dust that did not match the biscuits. The expression on Miss Clark's face. Most of all, the watch. The quarrel was petty. The murder was not. And behind such crimes lay motives that were never truly about heirlooms, but about the wounds that small insults carve into the heart. Poirot looked toward the house, toward the library where Henry had died, and whispered. Already, the pieces arrange themselves. Chapter 4: The Will and the Watch. By evening, the county inspector had completed his preliminary inquiries, though he looked no closer to comprehension than when he arrived. His notebook was filled largely with exclamation marks, underlined words such as argument, watch, and inheritance, and several uncertain arrows connecting Oliver's name to the word motive. Poirot, who had watched this process with patience, asked only one question when the inspector concluded his round. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur," he said mildly, "have you considered that if Monsieur Oliver wished to kill his cousin, he might have done so in a manner that did not leave a cup of tea beside the body?" The inspector frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot smiled. "Merely that tea. It suggests hospitality, or at least familiarity. If one intends to commit the crime of murder, one typically avoids domestic beverages. They create all sorts of questions. Who prepared it? Who brought it? Who was present? Murder presented on a tea tray, it is a complicated affair." The inspector stared at him, unsure whether he was being mocked. Poirot bowed slightly and took his leave. Later that night, Whitford House retained none of its sunny character. Shadows pooled in the corners, the corridors seemed too long, and the servants whispered behind doors as though their voices risked waking the dead. At 10:30, Lady Whitford sent for Poirot. He found her in the small morning room, sitting by the writing desk with a locked wooden document box before her. Miss Clark hovered behind her like a nervous sentinel. "Forgive the late hour," Lady Whitford began, "but this concerns Henry's affairs." Poirot nodded and sat opposite her. "I shall give you my utmost attention." She tapped her fingers on the box. "This contains Henry's papers, old correspondence, certificates, his insurance, and the draft of a codicil he intended to add to his will. I had not meant to open it until the solicitor arrived, but after today—" Her voice trembled. Miss Clark squeezed her shoulder gently. Poirot spoke quietly. "You are distressed, madam, and rightly so. But information is the ally of clarity. And clarity, it is always kind." Lady Whitford unlocked the box. Inside were neat bundles of documents tied with string, Henry's handwriting labeling each one. Poirot admired the man's orderliness, even in death. Lady Whitford removed one envelope. "This is the codicil. Henry did not finish it, his solicitor has not witnessed it, so it has no legal authority. But I feel you should see it." She handed it to Poirot. He unfolded the paper carefully. It read, "I, Henry Whitford, of Whitford House, in full possession of my faculties, hereby declare an amendment to my last will and testament." Poirot read silently until his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He placed the paper down. Lady Whitford asked anxiously, "What is in it, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot answered slowly. "It states that Henry intended to leave the pocket watch to Oliver." Lady Whitford gasped. "The watch? But he fought Oliver over it. He insisted it was his." Poirot nodded. "On the contrary, madam. He insisted publicly. But privately, it seems he intended reconciliation." Miss Clark's face was pale. "But why didn't he tell Oliver? Why quarrel instead of just granting it?" Poirot's eyes softened. "Because, mademoiselle, men sometimes quarrel most bitterly with the ones they wish to forgive. It is their pride that interferes. In this case, it appears to have interfered fatally." Lady Whitford lowered her head. "My boys?" Poirot continued, "The tragedy is greater than it first appears. The quarrel over the watch was not a battle of greed, but a battle of affection. And perhaps regret." Miss Clark turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Poirot then asked, "May I see the rest of the papers?" Lady Whitford nodded. Poirot sifted gently through the documents, pausing at a small ledger. Inside were Henry's neat accounts, including entries indicating payment to the solicitor, to a watchmaker in London, and, curiously, to a jeweller for engraving. Poirot murmured, "Engraving? What engraving?" He turned the page. A note was attached, for Oliver. His 30th birthday, June. Poirot closed the ledger. Oliver would have turned 30 next month. Miss Clark sank into a chair. They could have made peace. They truly could have. Poirot sighed, not theatrically but with the quiet sorrow of a man who had seen such ironies before. "It is the great tragedy of mankind," he said softly. "We wait too long to say the important things." The next morning, the solicitor himself arrived, Mr. Walter Severton, a tall, dry man who gave the impression of having been pressed recently in a large book. He confirmed the codicil. "Yes," he said, pushing his spectacles higher. "Henry consulted me 2 weeks ago. He wanted to adjust several small bequests, including the pocket watch. But he grew indecisive regarding the language. He wanted it to be, as he said, symbolic of reconciliation. He intended to finish it this week, in fact." Poirot asked, "Did he mention any other changes?" Mr. Severton nodded. He wished to make modest provision for Miss Clark as well, for her loyalty to Lady Whitford over the years. A very sentimental amendment, but perfectly within reason. Poirot noticed Miss Clark flush deeply. The solicitor continued, "As for property, the entailed estate goes automatically to Oliver, as it always has. There is no scandal there." But Poirot asked one more pointed question. "Monsieur, did Henry at any time express concerns for his safety?" The solicitor looked startled. "Safety? Good heavens, no. Henry was not the sort of man to fear danger. He feared embarrassment far more." Poirot nodded. "An embarrassment, monsieur, it is a powerful motivator." When noon came, the inspector, freshly emboldened by inexpert conclusions, declared Oliver Whitford a person of significant interest. He did not yet say suspect, but the implication hovered like a vulture waiting for certainty. Oliver himself seemed to shrink within the vast rooms of the house. He had spoken little since morning and now paced the corridor, hands clasped behind his neck. Poirot approached him. "Monsieur Oliver, might I have a moment?" Oliver stopped. "Yes, although I doubt I can tell you anything useful." Poirot placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "On the contrary, you have already told me much, though without words." Oliver frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot smiled faintly. "When your cousin left the tea table yesterday, your expression was not only anger. It was hurt. And the opposite of hate is not love, monsieur. It is indifference. You, I think, were never indifferent to Henry." Oliver looked away. His voice was low. "We envied each other, I suppose. He had the house, the position, the authority. But I had family warmth. People trusted me more easily. He hated that." Poirot responded, "And you hated that he needed to be admired." Oliver sighed. "Yes. That is exactly it." Poirot nodded. "Tell me, monsieur, what did you do last night after the quarrel?" Oliver stared at the floor. "I wrote a letter. To Henry. It sounds foolish now. I was so angry I could not speak to him, so I wrote instead. I left it under his door." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And what became of that letter?" Oliver shook his head. "I have no idea. It wasn't there this morning." Poirot tapped his chin. "A letter of anger, that disappears. Most intriguing." When Poirot retired to his room that evening, he did not sleep immediately. He sat at his writing desk and made a list, a habit he found most pleasing to his little grey cells. At the top, he wrote, "Facts. Henry quarrelled publicly. Henry intended to reconcile privately. Cyanide was used. The tea tray was fetched by a servant. The biscuits do not match the sugar dust. A letter to Henry vanished. The watch is missing." Then he wrote, "Motives. Oliver, resentment? Inheritance? Miss Clark, affection? Loyalty? Someone else, humiliation? Revenge? Poirot leaned back. Murder, he whispered, is rarely about what it appears to be. And in this case, appearances were far too convenient. Chapter 5: The Biscuit and the Letter. The next morning dawned bright, as though the weather had taken no notice of the disruption beneath the elegant roof of Whitford House. Sunlight poured across the lawns, birds trilled their usual songs, and yet the atmosphere at breakfast resembled a courtroom more than a family gathering. Oliver was not present at the table. Nor was Miss Clark. Only Lady Whitford, Arthur Lane, the solicitor, and Poirot took their seats, eating more out of duty than pleasure. A maid stood by awkwardly, uncertain whether she should continue serving under such troubled circumstances. Poirot stirred his porridge with absent-minded precision. Lady Whitford attempted politeness. "Has Inspector Mayhew returned from the village yet?" Arthur shook his head. "Not that I've seen." "I do hope he returns soon," she murmured. "This uncertainty is dreadful. One cannot even have breakfast without imagining handcuffs." Poirot took a sip of coffee. "Madam, the imagination is often far more cruel than the facts. We must not rush to fill the unknown with horror." She smiled weakly, though her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. After breakfast, Poirot excused himself and made for the library, not to stare at the scene of the crime, but to consider the missing item that had bothered him since the previous evening. The letter. Oliver had confessed to writing it and leaving it beneath Henry's door shortly after their quarrel. But it had vanished. Letters do not simply evaporate in well-run country houses. Poirot examined the writing desk. The surface had been cleared, the teacup removed, and the body long since taken to the undertaker. Yet Poirot noted a small detail others had missed: the blotter sheet was slightly askew. He lifted it carefully. Pressed faintly upon it were the marks of recent writing, not Henry's bold script, but lighter strokes, uneven in pressure. Poirot smiled. "Someone has been reading or copying something here," he murmured. He replaced the blotter and turned to the bookcases. One shelf bore a set of identical leather-bound volumes. A small gap betrayed that one had been recently removed. He drew out the missing volume from the adjacent shelf. Inside the pages near the center rested a folded paper. Poirot opened it. "Oliver, you cannot claim what was never yours. Grandfather made his wishes clear. You will not bully me into surrendering it. H.W." Poirot stared at the note for several seconds before chuckling softly. "Ah, Henry. How typical." This was not the letter Oliver wrote. It was Henry's response, sharp, defensive, entirely in character. But it had been hidden in a book, not delivered. Poirot placed it aside and continued to search. On a lower shelf, beneath a stack of magazines, he found a torn envelope bearing Oliver's handwriting. For Henry, read at once. Empty. So, the letter had reached Henry. Then someone removed it. Poirot tapped his fingers on the shelf lightly, a habit when his little grey cells were warming. As he left the library, he encountered Inspector Mayhew returning from the village with 2 constables in tow. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," the inspector announced, in a tone that suggested he had just discovered gravity. "I have news. The chemist confirms that cyanide was used." Poirot made a small flourishing gesture. "Of course." The inspector continued, proud of his conclusion. "Cyanide is used in pest control. The gardener keeps them locked in the tool shed. I've spoken to him. He says no one else has access. So it must have been Oliver who..." Poirot raised a hand, silencing him gently. "Monsieur, do not confuse opportunity with guilt. The gardener keeps the key. Oliver does not prune roses." The inspector reddened. "Well then, someone took it." That is still opportunity. Poirot bowed. An opportunity is plentiful in a house of many rooms. But allow me to ask, have you questioned the servants? The inspector blinked. Servants? Poirot resisted the urge to sigh. They carry trays. They polish cups. They move freely in spaces where the family sits still. They hear, they see, and most importantly, they know who quarrels and why. The inspector muttered that he would get to it and marched off. Poirot smiled faintly. Always they begin at the wrong end of the rope, he said to himself. But in time, perhaps they find the knot. Poirot then made for the servants' wing. He found the maid, Alice, polishing cutlery in a small pantry. She startled when she saw him. "Oh, sir. I didn't expect." Poirot bowed. "Pardon my intrusion, Mademoiselle Alice. I wish only to ask a small question about the tea tray from 2 nights ago." Alice hesitated. "The one I took to Mr. Henry." Poirot nodded. "Just so. Tell me, was anything unusual about it?" She screwed up her face in concentration. "Well, I put the teapot and the cup, and the sugar bowl, and the biscuits, but not the usual biscuits, since Mrs. Grant had set aside some almond ones for the family." "Very fancy," she said. Poirot stiffened. "Almond biscuits?" "Oh yes, sir," she said. "Only Mr. Oliver won't eat them on account of not liking the taste." Poirot's eyebrow rose. "Most interesting." He paused. "And the sugar?" Alice frowned. "Well, sir, the sugar bowl had a spoon in it when I took it up. But when I collected the tray next morning, the spoon was gone. I thought perhaps Mr. Henry had used it." Poirot asked, "Did you find it later?" "No, sir," Alice said nervously. "That's the odd thing, the bowl didn't have one when it came back. I asked Mrs. Grant if she'd taken it. She said no. We've not found it yet." Poirot smiled kindly. "You have been most helpful, mademoiselle. Another question, were you the one who found the tray?" Alice shook her head. "No, sir. James the footman found it when he went to dust the library." Poirot excused himself. Already the picture formed clearer. Almond biscuits. Oliver dislikes almonds. Cyanide smells of almonds. Ingredients disguised by flavor. A missing spoon. A letter removed. Too many almond ghosts for coincidence. Poirot next sought out James the footman. He found the young man polishing silver in the dining room. James spoke stiffly, as though confessing at altar. "I found the tray at 7:30, sir. The cup still had a bit of tea in it. I left it for Mrs. Grant." "Did you notice a letter?" Poirot asked gently. James hesitated, eyes flicking. "Letter, sir." Poirot did not blink. "Do not worry, James. Truth is rarely punished. It is the lie that causes headaches." James swallowed. "There was a letter, sir. On the desk." The inspector took it. Poirot's eyes flashed. "Took it? Without mentioning it?" James nodded. "I think so, sir. He said it was evidence." Poirot smiled politely. "Thank you, James. You have just solved more than you realize." Poirot located the inspector in the drawing room, rifling through his notes with the expression of a man hunting for logic in the dark. "Inspector," Poirot began smoothly, "you have a letter that once sat on Henry's desk. Might I see it?" The inspector hesitated. "It's not yet part of the formal report." Poirot leaned in. "Monsieur, if you keep evidence from the brain, how shall the brain do its work?" After a moment's grumbling, the inspector produced the letter. Poirot unfolded it. This one was unmistakably Oliver's hand. "Henry, you have humiliated me for the last time. I will not be treated as less than family. You will answer for your insults." "Oliver?" The inspector tapped it triumphantly. "Clear threat. Motive. Anger." Poirot smiled. "Threat? Perhaps. Anger? Certainly. But fatal? None." The inspector scoffed. "What else could it be?" Poirot folded the letter carefully. "It is something far more interesting, monsieur." He stood and clasped his hands. "It is the beginning of a misunderstanding." Chapter 6: Suspicions and Secrets. Inspector Mayhew, flushed with the misplaced satisfaction of having produced what he believed to be damning evidence, folded Oliver's letter back into his notebook as though sealing a case already solved. Poirot observed him with a mild expression, neither approving nor mocking. "You see only the fire, monsieur," he said quietly, "but not the fuel that fed it." The inspector frowned. A man writes a threat, his cousin winds up poisoned, and the chemist confirms cyanide. What more fuel do you need? Poirot clasped his hands. Anger does not always lead to murder. It may lead instead to letters, slammed doors, even regrettable dinners. Murder, however, requires intent and preparation. And your evidence is missing one essential element. The inspector bit. Which is? Poirot tapped the notebook. Proof of who placed the poison. Mayhew huffed and exited to question Lady Whitford once more. Poirot did not follow. He had no need to watch a man ask the same questions to the same people and expect a different answer. Instead, Poirot turned to the corridor and made his way toward the small drawing room. As he approached, he heard voices, subdued, tense. Miss Clark and Oliver. Poirot paused just out of sight. Eavesdropping was not his habit, yet there are moments when a door reveals more truth open than shut. I cannot believe they think I did it, Oliver murmured, voice shaking. Miss Clark answered softly, Oliver, they must investigate. That is how these things are done. But to treat me as though I slipped poison into his tea. I would never. Miss Clark made no reply. The silence carried its own weight. Oliver continued, lower now, raw with something more fragile than fury. He was cruel sometimes, yes. But he was still my cousin. I never wanted him dead. Poirot stepped inside then, for the confession was turning emotional, and emotion quickly becomes unproductive when one wishes for truth. You are correct, Monsieur Oliver, he said gently. You did not want him dead. You wanted him to feel your anger. A very different matter. Oliver looked up. Miss Clark straightened, smoothing her skirt as though to conceal the tremor in her hands. Were you listening? She asked, not quite accusing. Poirot bowed. Only for a moment, mademoiselle. And only because the house itself seems to whisper now, and I must be careful not to miss its conversation. Oliver gave a short, humorless laugh and sank into a chair. Poirot said nothing for several seconds. People often fill silence with truths they would never utter if questioned directly. But Oliver merely rubbed his temples, exhausted. Poirot shifted his gaze to Miss Clark. Mademoiselle, it appears you knew Henry in ways others did not. Her lips parted slightly. Meaning what? That you cared, Poirot replied simply. More than a mere companion to Lady Whitford. More than a passing acquaintance. Miss Clark flushed. I respected him. He was intelligent. Lonely, in his way. And you, a mademoiselle? Were you lonely also? Her eyes flickered, and in that flicker Poirot detected both grief and guilt, though guilt of what nature he could not yet say. she answered quietly. Most people in houses like these are lonely, Monsieur Poirot. Even when they are surrounded. Poirot inclined his head. Just so. An hour later, servants bustled through the corridors with feather dusters and laundry baskets, attempting to restore normal domestic rhythm, as though polishing the banisters would polish away scandal. Poirot intercepted Mrs. Grant, the cook, a woman shaped like a fortress and possessing opinions built to withstand any siege. "Mrs. Grant," Poirot said with a smile, "may I trouble you briefly?" "If it's about the meals, sir, they'll continue on schedule." "Lady Whitford insists we keep up appearances," she said briskly. Poirot chuckled. "I admire appearances. They reveal much, particularly when they are maintained too carefully." Mrs. Grant narrowed her eyes, uncertain how to take that. "I wish to ask," Poirot continued, "about the almond biscuits." Mrs. Grant sniffed. "They're not biscuits at all, sir. They're amaretti. Italian. A recipe of my grandmother's. I only make them for special occasions." Poirot nodded. "And you set them aside for the family tea 2 evenings ago?" "Yes. In a tin on the sideboard. Only Alice or James would have had access when they prepared the tray." Poirot tapped his chin. "And did you notice if any were missing afterward?" She hesitated. "The tin was short by 1, sir. I thought Lady Whitford must have taken it as a treat." Poirot bowed. "You have been most helpful." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Grant called after him. "Sir, you think the poison was in the biscuit?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Mrs. Grant, if one wishes to hide a bitter taste, one must choose a flavor that is already bitter." She paled. Poirot did not linger. By early afternoon, tension had reached a pitch. The inspector returned from the garden and announced that he intended to question Oliver formally. Lady Whitford protested, Miss Clark stood rigid with anger, and Oliver himself seemed to shrink into something smaller than a grown man with pride. Poirot approached the inspector with unusual urgency. "Monsieur," he said quietly, "there is something you must see before you take that step. Come with me." Mayhew, impatient but curious, followed Poirot to the library. Poirot gestured toward the leather-bound volume and withdrew the crisp note that Henry had written, the one he had not delivered to Oliver. The inspector read it, brow furrowing. "This contradicts the letter Oliver wrote." "Non," Poirot corrected. "It completes it." He handed the inspector Oliver's letter next. The inspector read them together. One letter, threat. The other, defiance. 2 men, declaring the same battle, on opposite fronts. Poirot leaned in. "You see, monsieur, this was not a one-sided quarrel. Both men wanted to wound the other, yes, but both expected to continue the argument. One does not write letters of indignation to a man one intends to kill or expects to die." The inspector stared at the papers. The certainty in his posture softened into uncertainty. Then what was Oliver's motive? Poirot smiled sadly. "Perhaps none. And there is something else." He reached into his pocket and produced a small metal item wrapped in a handkerchief. The inspector stiffened. "What is that?" Poirot unfolded the cloth. "The missing teaspoon. Found behind the books in the lower shelf, wiped hastily but not perfectly, and bearing a faint trace of crystalline dust." Poirot held it delicately. "This was not hidden by Oliver," he said softly. "People who hide things in panic choose the nearest place, drawers, pockets, under cushions. But this was placed. A deliberate concealment by someone who had the composure to think after the deed." Mayhew swallowed. "Who would do that?" Poirot folded the cloth back over the spoon. "Monsieur, that is what we must now determine." He paused before the door. "And I fear the answer lies not in anger, but in affection." Chapter 7. The Heart, Not the Heirloom. The storm that had been threatening the horizon finally broke just after dusk. Heavy clouds rolled over Whitford House, and thunder muttered above the chimneys like an impatient judge waiting for the accused to speak. Rain lashed the windows, turning the garden paths into rivulets of mud. Inside, the household gathered in the drawing room at Inspector Mayhew's insistence. In truth, he wished for a confrontation. In his mind, confession was most easily extracted when suspects sat beneath a single roof, stewing in one another's proximity. Poirot, seated near the fireplace, observed each person in turn as lightning briefly illuminated their faces. Lady Whitford sat rigidly, hands clasped together in her lap, her eyes swollen with sleeplessness. Miss Clark hovered behind her chair, protective and alert. Arthur Lane paced near the window, chain-smoking despite Lady Whitford's earlier protests. The solicitor, Mr. Severton, stood stiff as coat stand, his spectacles fogging slightly in the humid air. And Oliver, pale and exhausted, slumped in an armchair as though the weight of suspicion had added years to his frame. Inspector Mayhew cleared his throat dramatically. "I will come straight to the point," he announced. "I believe Oliver Whitford poisoned Henry Whitford over their quarrel." Lady Whitford gasped. Oliver's head jerked up. Arthur muttered an oath. Mayhew continued, emboldened. He had motive, resentment of his cousin's inheritance. He had opportunity, the two quarreled, and Henry was found alone shortly after. And we have his threatening letter as evidence of intent. He slapped his notebook shut as though he had solved the universe. Poirot lifted one eyebrow, a delicate, devastating gesture. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur," he said mildly, "you have motive, opportunity, and a letter. All three are common in detective novels, but in real life they are often insufficient." Mayhew glared. "You disagree?" Poirot shrugged lightly. "I observe. I do not yet conclude." Oliver pushed himself to his feet, voice trembling. "I did not kill Henry. I wrote that letter because I was angry, furious, even, but I went to bed before midnight. I didn't even see him again." Mayhew scoffed. "You could have visited his room later." "I didn't." Oliver snapped. Poirot interjected gently. "May I ask, Monsieur Oliver, where you slept last night?" "In my room at the end of the west corridor." "And did anyone see you after dinner?" "No, everyone retired." "Why? Does that condemn me further?" Poirot shook his head. "None. It simply clarifies. Solitude is not guilt." Mayhew opened his mouth to retort, but Poirot raised a hand. "What interests me," Poirot said, "is something the inspector has not asked." Lady Whitford leaned forward. "Which is?" Who else was awake? The question rippled across the room. Miss Clark's eyes flickered, just for an instant. Arthur paused his pacing. The solicitor straightened his spectacles. Poirot nodded slowly. "You see? When a murder occurs, it is rarely the loud conflicts which create the danger, it is the quiet, unseen movements." Mrs. Grant, the cook, who had been standing silently at the doorway, blurted, "Miss Clark was up late. I saw her go down the corridor near midnight." Miss Clark stiffened. "I was fetching a book from the study. I could not sleep." Lady Whitford turned, startled. "Greta? Why did you not tell me?" Miss Clark swallowed. "Because it was trivial. I didn't imagine it would matter." Inspector Mayhew pounced. "And after the study? Did you pay Henry a late-night visit?" Miss Clark's voice trembled now, though with indignation or pain it was difficult to tell. "How dare you imply such a thing? Henry and I—" She stopped herself, too late. Poirot's eyes narrowed, not unkindly. "Yes. Henry and you. You cared for him. Miss Clark stared at the floor. Lady Whitford looked bewildered. Greta, why did you not tell me? Miss Clark finally spoke, her voice small. Because Henry wished it to remain private. He feared scandal. He feared that Oliver would mock him, that the neighbors would whisper. He feared everything except loneliness. Arthur Lane stubbed out his cigarette. Well, that explains the melancholy in his letters. Miss Clark blinked. Letters? Arthur froze. Poirot's interest sharpened. You know of letters between Henry and Miss Clark? Arthur groaned. Lord help me. I should have held my tongue. Poirot stood. On the contrary, monsieur. The truth has waited long enough. Arthur sighed. Fine. Henry confided in me. After Greta came to work for Lady Whitford, Henry admired her. But he was too proud to pursue it openly. And she, forgive me, Greta, was too proud to beg for notice. So they circled each other in silence. Poirot nodded. Which explains much. Including why Henry intended to leave Miss Clark a small provision in the codicil. Miss Clark looked up sharply. He told the solicitor. No, Poirot said gently. But the documents told me. Miss Clark pressed a hand to her mouth. He never said a word to me. Not a single word. Lady Whitford blinked back tears. My poor Henry. He was always so afraid of vulnerability. Inspector Mayhew grew impatient. All very touching, but unrelated to the murder. Emotions do not exclude poison. Poirot looked at him steadily. On the contrary, monsieur. Emotions are the root of poison. But you are digging in the wrong soil. He paced slowly before the fireplace. You think this was a killing born of anger over a watch. I tell you it was a killing born of something far more delicate. Arthur scoffed. What, love? Poirot shook his head. No, monsieur. Not love. Something much subtler. He paused. Affection denied. The room fell still. Lady Whitford whispered, but who would kill over affection? Poirot stopped at the window as thunder cracked overhead. When affection is denied, Poirot said quietly, it becomes jealousy. And jealousy, when wounded, becomes cruelty. From there, the distance to murder is shorter than one imagines. Inspector Mayhew sneered. And who, in your view, suffered this wounded affection? Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he asked another question entirely. Madam, he said, turning to Lady Whitford, the pocket watch, has it been found? Lady Whitford shook her head helplessly. No. We have searched everywhere. Poirot clasped his hands. Then it has not vanished. It has been hidden. Oliver stared at him, voice low. By whom? Poirot looked directly at Miss Clark. And Miss Clark flinched. Not a large movement. Not a dramatic one. Just the smallest tightening of the throat, as though a voice wished to escape and was forced back down again. Oliver whispered, Good God! Lady Whitford gasped. Greta? What is this? Miss Clark's voice finally escaped, frail, broken. He was going to give it to Oliver, she whispered. He told me that afternoon. After all those years. After all that closeness. For a watch. Lightning flashed. Thunder followed. Poirot exhaled softly. At last, the heart of the matter. Inspector Mayhew nearly shouted, Are you saying she? Poirot lifted a finger. Inspector, nothing is said until the little grey cells have arranged the final picture. Do not rush the ending. He turned toward the center of the room. Tomorrow morning, he declared, we shall convene in the library. All of you. There I will present the complete arrangement of facts. His eyes glinted. And the murderer will have no place left to stand. Chapter 8. Poirot draws the net. The following morning dawned clear, as if the storm had washed the sky clean of all pretense. Whitford House, however, seemed heavier than ever. Breakfast was eaten in silence, even the servants moved about with hushed caution, as though fearing to disturb fragile truths waiting to surface. At 10 o'clock sharp, Inspector Mayhew assembled the household in the library. Chairs were drawn up in a semicircle before the fireplace, a makeshift courtroom. Lady Whitford sat nearest to the hearth, Miss Clark behind her, hands clasped tightly. Oliver sank into a chair beside the solicitor, while Arthur Lane paced restlessly near the window. The inspector himself stood with notebook ready, looking impatient for his suspect to be named so he might be done with the whole dreadful affair. Poirot entered last, immaculate as ever, the faintest sheen on his shoes, his moustaches curved in perfect order. He stood at the center of the room and surveyed each face slowly before speaking. Miss Amos, he began softly, murder is an act of violence upon the body. But its roots lie always in the spirit. If one wishes to understand who killed Monsieur Henry Whitford, one must first understand who loved him, who hated him, and who could not bear the difference between the two. He allowed the words to settle, for silence makes truth audible. Let us begin, Poirot said, with the facts of the poisoning. He gestured toward the table where the teacup and saucer had been placed once more for demonstration. Henry Whitford was poisoned with cyanide. Cyanide has the scent of bitter almonds. The flavor of the biscuit served with the tea, also almond. This made the poison almost undetectable to the palate. Thus we know that the murderer understood three things: Henry's habit of taking tea before bed, the preparation of the tray, and the masking properties of the biscuit. Mrs. Grant, standing behind the chairs, swallowed hard. Poirot continued, the almond biscuit tin was in the pantry. The sugar bowl was set on the tray. But the spoon vanished. We found it later in the bookcase, wiped but not entirely clean. A nervous hider conceals close at hand. But a deliberate mind chooses a place where it will not be seen unless one knows to look. He looked at Oliver. You, Monsieur Oliver, were angry. You wrote letters, you slammed doors, you argued with a tongue sharpened by envy and hurt. But anger is messy. Your actions were messy. The murder was not. Oliver exhaled in relief so sudden it became a shudder. Poirot then turned to Arthur Lane. You, Monsieur Arthur, possessed knowledge of Henry's private feelings. You were confidant and friend. But you neither inherited nor quarreled. You had no cause to kill a man whose secrets you safeguarded. Arthur relaxed visibly, shoulders falling. Poirot's gaze moved to the solicitor. Monsieur Severton, you knew of the codicil. You knew Henry intended to leave sentimental gifts, not wealth. But your part was merely to witness words, not deeds. The solicitor nodded stiffly. Poirot now gestured to Lady Whitford. Madam, you loved both your boys. Even in their quarrels you hoped for reconciliation. You wished for peace. Murder is not born of such hope. Lady Whitford dabbed her eyes. Poirot paused for effect. And so, what remains? Words. Letters. The hidden quarrel, not the one at tea, but the one in the heart. He turned to Miss Clark. Mademoiselle, you loved Henry Whitford. The room froze. Miss Clark's lip trembled, but she did not speak. Poirot continued gently, he loved you also. But he loved you as men of pride so often do, in silence, in secrecy, in indecision. He planned to leave you a provision in his will, but could not bring himself to speak the words that would have made the provision unnecessary. Miss Clark's eyes filled. I did not. I never asked him for anything. Poirot nodded. Just so. But you wanted to be chosen, mademoiselle. Instead, the one thing Henry chose to give, the pocket watch, he intended for Oliver. A token of reconciliation between the cousins. Arthur murmured, "Good Lord." Poirot held up a hand. "This is key." Mademoiselle knew of the watch. Henry told her that afternoon. In confidence. He wished to surprise Oliver for his birthday. A noble gesture. He turned again to Miss Clark. "But to you, mademoiselle, it was a betrayal. You believed Henry gave more affection to Oliver in that single gesture than he ever gave to you in months." Miss Clark clutched her handkerchief. "He had promised." Poirot's voice softened. "Promised what?" Miss Clark blinked through tears. "Promised that I mattered. That there would be something more." Poirot nodded. "And so, to your wounded heart, the watch became evidence that you were not chosen." Jealousy roared where affection whispered. It was not the value of the watch, it was the value of the sentiment. Inspector Mayhew blurted, "So she stole the watch?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Stole? None. She hid it." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in linen. Gasps circled the room as he unwrapped the pocket watch. "Tarnished, dented, unmistakable." "Found," Poirot announced, "beneath the cushion of Lady Whitford's favourite window seat. A place only someone intimate with the household would know. And a place reserved for private sorrow." Miss Clark closed her eyes. Poirot placed the watch gently on the table. But jealousy alone does not kill. What kills is the fear that affection, once denied, will never be reclaimed. Mademoiselle went to Henry's room that night. She confronted him. She begged. He refused, not harshly, but timidly, as is the way of men who fear emotion. He tried to soothe her. He promised explanations later. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And then he took tea. A single tear escaped down Miss Clark's cheek. Poirot bowed his head slightly. "You seized the moment. 1 teaspoon. A dash of sugar. 1 almond biscuit to hide the smell. Perhaps you intended only illness, something that would keep him from Oliver for a day, enough to make him see you. But cyanide is not an instrument of half measures." Miss Clark whispered, "I only wanted him to suffer, to feel what I felt." Poirot nodded. "Yes. And he did suffer. But the heart, it is a poor chemist. It does not measure dosage." Inspector Mayhew snapped his notebook shut. "Miss Clark, I must." Poirot raised a hand. "1 moment more, monsieur." He turned to Lady Whitford, voice soft as silk. "Murder is rarely born of hatred, madam. It is born of love that has gone astray." Lady Whitford sobbed. "Greta, why did you not tell me?" Miss Clark looked at her with hollow eyes. "Because I was the outsider. I was never her daughter. Never his wife. Never even Oliver's sister. I was simply present." Poirot bowed his head. And yet presence is sometimes the most painful role of all. Miss Clark did not resist when the inspector led her away. Arthur Lane offered to accompany Lady Whitford to her room. Oliver remained seated, staring at the watch with an expression that hovered between grief and gratitude. Poirot stood alone in the library for several minutes, listening to the echoes of footsteps fade through the house. At last he whispered to the empty room. "It is always the small quarrels that wound most deeply." He straightened his tie, glanced once more at the watch, and left the library behind. For the case was closed, and the little grey cells were satisfied.